From the Heritage Foundation, I'm Michelle Cordero, and this is Heritage Explains. It's a new year, and lawmakers across the country are gearing up again for high-profile fights over gun control legislation that could severely limit your Second Amendment rights. This makes it really important that we continue to emphasize the important role lawful gun owners play, not just as a long-term protection against tyrannical governments, but in immediate and regular defense against crime. Almost every major study in this has concluded that Americans use firearms in lawful defense of themselves and others between 500,000 and 3 million times every year. Yet, as we've pointed out on this podcast, these are not the stories that make their way to the national cable channels. Like this story, for example, out of Las Vegas.
Well, Gerard, Metro officers on scene say that suspect waited for hours before going inside the home. Officers say once he was inside, a woman shot and killed him, but police say she acted in self-defense.
And I realized that something traumatic has happened in my neighborhood.
As crime scene tape covered houses.
And I thought, well, what's going on?
And multiple cop cars filled the streets.
Oh my gosh, the whole street was full.
Neighbors like Deb Scheit say they still can't believe it.
You never think, wow, this can happen in my neighborhood.
Officers say the shooting happened this morning. A man attempted to burglarize a home, but was shot by a woman inside.
I heard a pop sound. Not too long later, I noticed that there was some crime tape that was being put up.
Police are calling this self-defense. They say the suspect drove off with a flat front tire. Sterling Boyd, who lives a few houses down, saw it drive by.
They kept going, and they rounded the corner and didn't think much of it.
The suspect was pulled over, according to officers. He was taken to the hospital where he later died. Those next door say they're supporting their neighbor.
She has my respect and my prayers.
Somebody was in my backyard, well, I'd probably do the same thing that lady did.
Over the course of 2019, Amy Swearer, a senior legal policy analyst in Heritage's Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, has been documenting several dozen examples of Americans relying on their Second Amendment rights to protect life, liberty, and property. Last year, we talked with Amy about some of those stories, and we're going to do it again in this episode. I should also note that since we sat down with Amy, she's been testifying all over the country about gun safety, mass shootings, and how to protect Americans while still protecting Second Amendment rights. Her recent testimony before the House Judiciary Committee went viral and currently has over 1 million views on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, you should, and we'll link to it in the show notes. One more thing before we get started. This episode contains audio clips of gun violence that could be upsetting to some audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Amy, every month last year, you brought readers' attention to several dozen examples of Americans relying on their Second Amendment rights. Why do you think it's so important to do this?
So often, it seems to me like these conversations about gun policy, they end up boiling down to Second Amendment advocates getting either caricatured or, Second Amendment advocates tend to rely, as I think they rightfully should, on sort of the philosophy and the statistics underlying, why we are for or against certain policies or in favor of a strong Second Amendment right. And while I think that's important, it tends to dehumanize, I think, a lot of the very real examples of this, where it's real people with real names and faces and stories to tell. And I think when you bring back that human component, when you get to sort of reclaim, this is what a law-abiding gun owner is. This is the context in which they're using their guns in an appropriate manner. I think it adds another element to that conversation that, again, it feels like it gets lost so often in the numbers, in important numbers. But I feel like that conversation needs that depth that is just lacking right now.
So 2019 ended just as it began. This is the second time we've gone through this, but we're going to kind of roll through some of the more important instances this year, and there are plenty examples. Let's talk about some of these examples.
To me, I think that the place really to start is almost one of the last days of the year, December 29th, down in White Settlement, Texas. This was a very high-profile instance of defensive gun use, but it's so powerful. So you had what essentially would have been a mass shooting in a church during a church worship service, where you had an armed individual who was able to confront that shooter within 6 seconds and end that.
Yeah, we have some audio of that we'd like to play for our listeners. And again, as I warned everyone earlier, if you have little ears nearby, today's episode could be upsetting. So I just want to give you that warning up front. Amy, can you explain what we're about to hear, but we can't see exactly?
Sure. So this audio actually comes from a live stream of that church service. So if you're looking at the video, you're actually seeing kind of like a bird's eye view of a congregation, congregation you'd see every Sunday across the country, probably about 200 or 300 people sitting in pews, and they're just finishing up their communion portion of the service. So it's for those of you who go to church regularly, there's kind of a lull there sometimes as the instruments used for communion are being put away, and they're sort of transitioning to the next portion of the service. And you see in the back, in one of the last pews, an individual stand up and actually take out a shotgun that he had been concealing in kind of like a trench coat. And this, of course, catches the attention of some individuals in the back who also then stand up. And what you'll hear is 3 gunshots being fired. But what you can't see is that the last shot is actually from someone I hope we get a chance to talk about more, a guy named Jack Wilson, who was armed that day, who, again, within 6 seconds was able to stand up and end that confrontation with actually an incredible shot from about 50 feet away. So that's the picture to paint for you sort of as you're listening to this.
Yeah, that's really difficult to listen to and even harder to watch. Amy, you said the gunman was actually able to kill 2 people?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there were 2 deaths other than the gunman. But again, you're dealing with a situation where had he not been confronted as quickly as he was, there were well over 200, possibly up to 300 innocent people in this church service, in a packed house of worship. And so it is, again, it's very unfortunate and I'm sure devastating for the community for those 2 lives that were lost. But again, at the end of the day, what you see here is the ability of a law-abiding citizen to stand up and to end that much more quickly than it would have otherwise ended.
So ahead of our recording, you brought to my attention another attack on a church in Texas in 1980. Vice News did a piece on this attack, and we have some audio from their coverage that we'd like to share as well.
In the small town of Dangerfield, Texas this morning, a heavily armed man dressed in Army gear walked into a Baptist church, yelled, "This is war," and opened fire on the congregation.
It's actually really hard to listen to and not get emotional. Amy, what was it about this 1980s attack that made you think it was worth digging it back up?
To me, it's really the striking similarity between, again, just this sort of live stream, the audio. For me, my dad's a pastor. So you talk about getting emotional. This to me is this is me every Sunday. This is my dad. These are the people I grew up with. That I see in my mind.
And what happened in that? We kind of glossed over that. It's not the same.
No, absolutely. And so to bring that back, I mean, in Dangerfield in 1980, you saw a very similar instance. And frankly, very similar to what you also saw in 2017 in Sutherland Springs. Of an individual who walks into a place of worship bent on killing innocent people while they worship God. And so in that instance, to me, what was striking was that there wasn't anybody armed in that church. And I think ultimately there were 5 deaths, 10 or 12 very serious injuries. But that individual in 1980 was stopped because several members of the church essentially jumped on him. This is a guy who had a semi-automatic rifle with bayonets attached to it. So you can imagine sort of the carnage there and the danger that those congregants put themselves in by as unarmed congregants just jumping on this individual. And to me, it was striking sort of how different the endings were, while still being very similar, because ultimately the guy was subdued. But the ability of Jack Wilson in this later instance, this instance from December 29th, to stand up from 50 feet away and to be able to end that threat without putting himself or anybody else in more danger. To me, sort of seeing how this congregation in White Settlement had sort of learned from these past instances to say, no, we're not gonna leave our people sort of unshepherded, unguarded, if you will, from any would-be wolves that want to stand up and harm them during a worship service. So you see, even starting back in 1980, that's where you start seeing the development, especially in Texas, of wanting armed church security, of wanting to protect people while they worship. And of course, it really caught on, I think, after 2017 in Sutherland Springs. And that ultimately is why Jack Wilson was armed that day, is because you had, again, just churches looking at history, saying this is a thing that people have done in the past to try to harm people during church services. And we are not going to allow it. We're going to give our parishioners the ability to fight back.
You've stressed in your writing that from a purely statistical standpoint, these 2 events we just highlighted are actually really rare events. And when we're talking about just the more general numbers of defensive gun uses, so not necessarily stopping a would-be mass shooter, but, for example, someone who's breaking into your house, there are way more of those. Let's talk about some of those instances you documented this year.
So what comes to mind, for example, there's an instance October 11th in Yuba County, California. So if you remember, during October, there are a lot of wildfires, lots of evacuations happening in this area of California. And so you had a homeowner whose family was asleep upstairs. They're in a neighborhood that, it had just come back from mandatory evacuations. A lot of people were still evacuated. Their power had been out, I think, for several days at this point. So some nearby families had generators. They had turned their generator off for the night. And a would-be burglar, looks at this situation. A lot of people abandoning their homes, the power's off, looks at this and says, you know what, this is a great target for me as a criminal. And so breaks into this house thinking that it's abandoned. But it's not. It's, the law-abiding citizen with their family sleeping upstairs. And unfortunately, he gets into a confrontation with this criminal and ends up having to defend himself and his family in a place that, again, is evacuated. There's not really police in this near vicinity, and ends up having to rely on his Second Amendment rights to defend himself against the type of person who would take advantage of this horrible situation to try to steal things.
Right. I want to take a moment to just drop in a quick suggestion for our listeners right now. If you like what you're hearing, you should subscribe to Heritage's weekly email called The Agenda. Every Monday morning, we give you the conservative perspective, along with television interviews from our experts, like Amy, on issues like the ones we're talking about right now, as well as important events happening at the Heritage Foundation. You can sign up by emailing managingeditor@heritage.org or scroll down to the bottom of heritage.org and look for the subscribe to email updates section at the bottom of the page. Okay, now back to our conversation.
Continuing on, just later to that month, October 30th in Tampa, Florida, this was actually one that did make the national news to a lesser extent than I think we saw with Jack Wilson, but just an incredible story. So you had 2 armed men who broke into this home of a young family and start severely beating the father, still unclear why, but start beating the father, threatening the 11-year-old daughter with those firearms. And the man's wife, who is 8 months pregnant, so very, very pregnant, here's what's going on. realizes that something very bad is happening and grabs her husband's AR-15 in another part of the house. And keep in mind, again, very, very pregnant.
Yeah.
Walks out with this AR-15. All she has to do is fire one shot at these two armed criminals, one of whom is shot, and the other goes, "I am not messing with this," and flees the house. And so this woman, who you'd otherwise think is very vulnerable, very much at risk, not able to defend herself, probably much less others, because of the overwhelming force, that balance of power that she's given back with that AR-15, she's able to scare off, two people who otherwise felt very secure, breaking into a family's home and threatening them with violence. So just an incredible story out of Tampa, Florida.
And you say that was nationally covered? I didn't hear about it. So
right.
Yeah.
By nationally covered, I mean,
yeah.
it may have gotten, like a 30-second blurb.
Exactly.
And that's it. So if you missed it, you were never going to find it.
Yeah.
And then moving on to November. So we hear all the time about, women, women are the ones most impacted by gun violence, which isn't true outside of a domestic violence context. But inside of a domestic violence context, I think it's important to look at the reality of women being able to fight back against would-be attackers. So on November 28th, out of McCleary, Washington, you had a woman who already had a domestic violence protection order out against her estranged husband. But keep in mind, that's just a piece of paper. That doesn't forcibly stop anyone bent on harming you. And so she is staying at a friend's house, and her estranged husband breaks in with a knife, bent on attacking her and this friend she's staying with. And that woman was able to use her firearm to defend herself and her friend, ultimately shooting and killing this individual who was, again, ignoring a protection order that was already in place that he was willing to ignore. And then just 2 days later, out of Ellenwood, Georgia, I love this story. This is probably one of my favorite, for me, one of the most memorable out of the year. So you had a delivery man who was unloading his truck. I think he was delivering bread to a Hardee's restaurant. Just doing his thing, unloading his bread, and a couple employees come running out of the store screaming, essentially saying, "There's a guy in there robbing us." It's this delivery man. Keep in mind, like his job is just to deliver the bread and get back in his truck
and get out of there. Yeah,
he gets into his truck, grabs his firearm from his truck, that he's presumably using for self-defense for his own. He runs into the store to confront this guy who's terrorizing employees in the store, and ends up being able to shoot and send this guy fleeing. Sends the attacker fleeing. Thank goodness the attacker is ultimately captured by law enforcement, but he was able to save people who were being genuinely threatened. And it gets better because the local sheriff's department actually ends up putting this guy, they had what they call the Posse Hall of Fame. So they honor this guy as a law-abiding citizen by putting his picture in their Posse Hall of Fame to be like, this is our Hall of Fame for law-abiding citizens protecting other people.
How brave, too.
Oh, absolutely. Because it wasn't himself being threatened. Mm-hmm. It was him seeing that other people were in fear for their life. And being able to step into that situation with that poison, with that courage.
It's such a good balance there of good and evil, that the evil exists, but, the bread delivery man, who knows what he has inside him to jump in and save the day.
Right, absolutely.
So in conclusion, kind of a year-end, what do you think is the most important lesson we can draw from some of these examples?
So I'd say there are actually two. For me, I think the biggest example of what I'm about to say actually comes from Jack Wilson in the White Settlement shooting. If you're a law-abiding gun owner, again, you hope you're never going to have to use your gun in defense of yourself or others. I mean, that would be the preferred course, right? I'm never in danger of my life. The lives of other people are never in danger around me. But if you are a law-abiding gun owner, because you never know when that's going to happen, when you're going to be called upon or what type of shot you're going to have to make, that you should be well trained with your firearms. You should be confident in your ability to handle that You should think through these scenarios so that, that the first time you have to think through it isn't when you're being actively confronted by it. And I think you saw that with the poise of Jack Wilson, his command of the situation. So I think, that to me is the biggest point is you don't know when this is going to happen. Be prepared for it. The second, I think, is that we need to keep telling these stories because so many people don't hear them. They don't hear them on the local news. They don't hear them on the national news, but they are happening. And I think it'd shock people, in their own neighborhoods. The types of people in the types of neighborhoods. These are not, would-be Rambos going out there. These vigilantes trying to, itching for a fight, trying to take down bad guys. These are 8-month pregnant women. These are 19-year-old kids living alone on their own. It's single women and domestic violence victims. And we need to keep telling their stories because if we don't, they get caricatured as something that they're not. And it loses an aspect, a very human aspect of this conversation. And so I know on our end, we certainly will continue telling these stories. And I think, and I hope that everyone else will continue telling them as well.
Thank you for documenting them. And I know that Heritage Explains will continue to have you on so we can keep sharing them with our listeners. And that's it for this week's episode. You can find Amy's recent op-ed with these stories, as well as all the links to all of her reporting throughout the year in our show notes. We're looking for new topics for Heritage Explains, and we would love to hear from you. Email us at managingeditor@heritage.org, and your topic could be featured on the podcast. Tim will be back with a new episode next week.
Heritage Explains is produced by Michelle Cordero and Tim Desher, with editing by Thalia Rampersad.